Information Policy, U.S. Department of State, on behalf of the World Conference on International Telecommunications Ad Hoc Working Group. Ms. Sally Shipman Wentworth, she's the Senior Manager, Public Policy for Internet Society, and Mr. Vint Cerf, Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. We all admire that title and your work, Mr. Cerf, certainly that empowered us to have Internet protocols and addresses and all those things you created or helped create, and we love the title, Internet Evangelist. So again, we thank our prior panel and their testimony, and we will start right in with Ambassador Gross, will be our lead-off witness on the second panel. And again, just pull those microphones close, make sure the lights are lit, and you should be good to go. Thank you, Ambassador, for your work on this issue in the past. We look forward to your comments today.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. It's a great privilege and honor to be back here with you all again. I appreciate it very much. And I probably should start with an apology to the audience that I did not bring lunch with us, so I'll try to be brief. I want to underscore a couple of points that were made both by the questions and the answers presented by the first panel. First of all, I think it's extraordinarily important for the American people to know that I think the preparations for the upcoming WICET conference are in excellent hands. I think we've seen this demonstrated by the statements and actions by Ambassador Revere, who you saw this morning, by Assistant Secretary Larry Strickling, by the White House, including Danny Weissler, who's played an important role, and as was announced by earlier today by Ambassador Revere, the incoming head of delegation, Terry Kramer. I will confess I've known Terry for many years. We worked together at AirTouch. We've been good friends for many years, and I could not be more pleased and confident of a successful outcome because of what I'm sure will be his excellent leadership. I would say that his leadership is particularly important and helpful in addressing some of the questions that were raised to the first panel about the ability to create and form successful coalitions to be able to identify the issues. He has great experience not only in the telephone industry, but also having worked and been very active internationally. He knows what it takes to bring people together and to be able to find that consensus that will be very important. I'd also want to recognize, of course, as you all have already done this morning, the extraordinary work that has been done by FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell. He has been tireless and passionate and very focused on this issue in ways that have greatly served all of us, and I personally and professionally am so pleased by his leadership to date. Having had the great honor of working on these issues for many years at the U.S. State Department and elsewhere, I think there are a few core principles that make this particularly important. One that was stressed earlier today about the importance of bipartisanship. And I would like to commend both sides of the aisle and this committee, particularly and its members, for the great work that you've done with regard to the new Resolution 127. I think that's really quite extraordinary. When I had the honor of leading the U.S. delegation, co-leading the U.S. delegation to the World Summit of the Information Society, the UN Heads of State Summit, a similar joint resolution was enacted, and I found that to be extraordinarily useful and important for us as we went forward, because the world recognizes the importance and the role that Congress plays on these issues domestically and internationally, and it is an important signal. The bipartisanship is a particularly important signal there, that these are issues for which we are all together. I would also say that I have the great honor currently of chairing an ad hoc committee that has been put together to address the WICET issues and the like, and I think there is much to be learn from the diverse membership of that group. That group often takes different views on domestic issues, and that's to be expected. But they come together and are unified, as the American people, I believe, are unified on the issue that brings us together about the Internet, the importance of the Internet, and the role of intergovernmental organizations and others with regard to that going forward. There are two sort of things that I think are particularly important to focus on about WICET. One is it's important to remember this is not just another conference, but this is a treaty writing conference. The output of this will not be just language that is used, but in fact international law. And therefore it's very, very important that the details be dealt with very carefully. It's also very important because this affects not just the American people, but people globally. And the U.S. is always looked to by the people around the world for that leadership, and I am confident that that leadership will be maintained. It is the great changes that have happened in the world, the great growth in the Internet, that has benefited the people in the developing world and elsewhere perhaps most dramatically. And I think that is first and foremost something that we always need to keep in mind. It's also important to recognize, as many of the comments this morning, that this is not about the ITU as an institution. The ITU is an important institution to the United States. Hamadoun Touré, the Secretary General, has been very important as a leader and very helpful to the United States and otherwise. Having said that, this is about other member states that has been outlined by a number of the answers earlier today, and those are the issues and the coalitions we need to build, the issues we need to address, and the facts we need to gather. And with that, I believe my time is about to expire, and I don't want to delay this any further. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Gross, thank you not only for your leadership on this issue, but your testimony today and your encouragement on our bipartisan resolution, which we hope to be able to move rather rapidly to the House floor. Mr. Cerf, we're delighted and honored to have you here today, sir. We look forward to your verbal presentation, your testimony, and your insights on this matter.
Thank you very much, Chairman Walden, and I see that Ranking Member Eshoo had to depart, but I certainly appreciate her participation today. And members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to address you. My name is Vint Cerf. I currently serve as Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. As one of the fathers of the Internet, and as a computer scientist, I care deeply about the future of the Internet. And I'm here today because the open Internet has never been at higher risk than it is now. A new international battle is brewing, a battle that will determine the future of the Internet. And of all of us, from Capitol Hill to corporate headquarters to Internet cafes in far-off villages, don't pay attention to what's going on, users worldwide will be at risk of losing the open and free Internet that has brought so much to so many and can bring so much more. If we follow one path, a path of inclusion, openness, and common sense, I'm convinced that the Internet of the future will be even more powerful, an even more powerful economic engine and communications tool than it is today. The other path is a road of top-down control dictated by governments. This would be a very different system, a system that promotes exclusion, hidden deals, potential for indiscriminate surveillance, and tight centralized management, any one of which could significantly hinder Internet innovation and growth. At the crossroads stands the International Telecommunication Union, an agency of the United Nations that came into being to regulate international telegraph services just 4 years after the Pony Express closed its doors. This agency plans to meet in 6 months to consider proposed changes to the international agreements governing telecommunications. Until this year, the ITU, which through the UN includes 193 member countries, each with only a single vote, has focused its attention on telecommunications networks and policies such as setting international standards for telephone systems, coordinating the allocation of radio frequencies, and encouraging the development of telecommunications infrastructure in developing nations. On the whole, this status quo has been benign and even helpful to the spread of the Internet. But the organization recently passed a resolution in Guadalajara calling to, quote, increase the role of the ITU in Internet governance, end quote. This should cause significant concern. In addition, some powerful member states see an opportunity to assert control over the Internet through a meeting in Dubai this coming December. Several proposals from member states of the ITU would threaten free expression on the web. Others have called for unprecedented mandates and economic regulations that would, for example, impose international Internet fees in order to generate revenue for state-owned telecommunications companies. The international attack on the open Internet has many fronts. Take, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which counts China, Russia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan among its members. This organization submitted a proposal to the UN General Assembly last September for a so-called International Code of Conduct for Information Security. The organization's stated goal was to establish government-led international norms and rules standardizing the behavior of countries concerning information and cyberspace. Should one or more of these proposals pass, the implications are potentially disastrous. First, new international control over the Internet could trigger a race to the bottom, where serious limits on the free flow of information could become the norm rather than the exception. Already, more than 20 countries have substantial or pervasive online filtering, according to the OpenNet initiative. And the decentralized bottom-up architecture that enabled the Internet's meteoric rise would be flipped on its head. The new structure would have the unintended consequence of choking innovation and hurting American business abroad. As you can see, the decisions made this December in the ITU could potentially put regulatory handcuffs on the net, with a remote UN agency holding the keys. And because the ITU answers only to its member states, rather than to citizens, civil society, academia, the technical industry, and the broad private sector, there's a great need to insert transparency and accountability into this process. So, what can you do? I encourage this committee to take action now by urging the U.S. government, in partnership with like-minded countries and their citizens, to engage in this process and protect the current bottom-up pluralistic system of Internet governance, and to insist that the debate at the ITU and all other international fora be open to all stakeholders. It is critically important for you to engage and help ensure that the world understands that the economic, social, and technical advances driven by the Internet are endangered by these efforts. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this very serious matter. I look forward to answering your questions.
Mr. Cerf, thank you. We appreciate your leadership and comments. And now we'll go to Sally Shipman Wentworth, Senior Manager, Public Policy, Internet Society. Ms. Shipman, thank you for being here. We look forward to your testimony as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Sally Shipman Wentworth, and I am Senior Manager of Public Policy for the Internet Society, a nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring the open development, evolution, and use of the Internet for the benefit of all people throughout the world. On behalf of the Internet Society and our more than 55,000 members worldwide, many of whom are joining us in the audience and are watching the webcast around the world, I would like to sincerely thank Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and all the members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify on this important issue. The Internet Society was founded in 1992 by many of the same pioneers who built the Internet, one who's sitting next to me. Since that time, the organization has served as a global resource for technically vetted, ideologically unbiased information about the Internet, as an educator for technologists and policymakers worldwide, and as an organizer and driver of community-based Internet initiatives around the world. The Internet Society also serves as the organizational home for the Internet Engineering Task Force, whose mission it is to make the Internet work better. We produce high-quality, relevant technical documents that influence the way people design, use, and manage the Internet. These technical documents include the standards, guidelines, and best practices that created and continue to shape the Internet today. The International Telecommunication Union's upcoming World Conference on International Telecommunications has rightfully drawn heightened attention from the global community, as some ITU member states have proposed amendments to a key treaty, the ITRs, that could have far-reaching implications for the Internet. While the Internet Society has no voting role in the ITU process, we do participate as what is called a sector member. In that capacity, we have raised significant concerns that, rather than enhancing global interoperability, the outcome of the WICET meeting could undermine the security, stability, and innovative potential of networks worldwide. The Internet Society understands why some of the ITU member states are focusing on the Internet and its infrastructure. The Internet has fundamentally changed the nature of communications globally, and many nations view those changes as falling under the auspices of the ITU. Some proposals to the WICET stem from the very real economic pressures that developing nations face as they seek to update their national policy frameworks to allow them to engage fully in the global information economy. But we are not convinced that the international treaty-making process represents the most effective means to manage cross-border Internet communications or to achieve greater connectivity worldwide. We are concerned that some of the proposals being floated in advance of the December meeting are not consistent with the proven and successful multi-stakeholder model. And finally, we are concerned that the WCIT process itself, which severely limits meaningful non-governmental participation, could create negative outcomes for the Internet. The Internet model is characterized by several essential properties that make it what it is today, a global, unified network of networks that is constantly evolving, that has provided enormous benefits, that enables extraordinary innovation, and whose robustness is based on a tradition of open standards, community collaboration, and bottom-up consensus. As the Internet has flourished, Internet policy development at the global, regional, and national levels has continued to evolve to work harmoniously with the Internet to assure its ongoing development. This process has provided the capacity to cope with the necessary and fast-paced technological evolution that has characterized the Internet to date. In contrast to this approach, some WCIT submissions seek to apply old-line legacy telecommunication regulations to Internet traffic in a manner that could lead to a more fragmented, less interoperable global Internet for all. For example, proposals related to traffic routing, numbering, and peering would have significant impacts on the future growth of the Internet. But while we find strong cause for concern about the agenda of the WCIT meeting, there is no reason why it cannot produce thoughtful, worthwhile policy developments that advance the mission of the ITU and the ongoing expansion of global communications without imposing dangerous and unnecessary burdens on the Internet. Many ITU member states, including the U.S., have shown that they understand the value of the Internet and its unique multi-stakeholder model. Those delegates are in a critical position to advance an agenda at WCIT that respects the Internet and its global contributions while continuing to support the pro-competitive policies that have been so successful since the ITRs were first negotiated in 1988. Working with allies from around the globe, the United States government has an opportunity to help chart a productive course forward at WCIT and to ensure that the value of the multi-stakeholder model and a light-touch regulatory approach are highlighted. The Internet Society stands ready to play its part in this process and to assist the subcommittee in any way it can. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Ms. Wentworth, thank you for your testimony. We'll go into questions now. And I want to go straight to you. You mentioned in your testimony there are other parts of the United Nations that have activities concerning Internet governance. And if the ITU meeting is not the only place where this is being discussed, what other things are going on that we should be aware of?
Yes, thank you for that question. I do think it's important that we put the WCIT in context. The WCIT is an extremely important event in 2012. It is a treaty-making conference, but the discussion of Internet governance will not stop there. There are ongoing discussions within the United Nations framework, in the Commission for Science and Technology for Development, within the International Telecommunications Union, and within the UN General Assembly that seek to take on these issues of Internet governance with a great deal of specificity. All of these discussions are things that we at the Internet Society are following carefully, and we think that multi-stakeholder engagement and discussion of these issues over the next several years is going to be extremely important.
Mr. Cerf, you seem to be weighing in there with a nodding head.
I'm certainly in agreement with Ms. Wentworth. First of all, the ITU is not the only element in the United Nations that is interested in Internet matters. The point about the Committee on Science and Technology is one example. ECOSOC is another. There's a long list of players who see the Internet as a very fundamental part of the environment now, and they would like very much to have some influence over it. I worry about even such activities as the Internet Governance Forum, which emerged out of the World Summit on the Information Society. The reason it has been successful, at least up until now, is that it started as a multi-stakeholder activity, but as responsibility for the subject matter under discussion in the IGF shifted from one body to another, the question about who controls the agenda now becomes a big issue. The process of involvement in the United Nations has one unfortunate property, that it politicizes everything. All the considerations that are made, whether it's in the ITU or elsewhere, are taken and colored by national interests. As a long-standing participant in the Internet Architecture Board and the Internet Engineering Task Force, where we check our guns at the door, and we have technical discussions about how best to improve the operation of the Internet, to color that with other national disputes which are not relevant to the technology is a very dangerous precedent, and that's one of the reasons I worry so much about the ITU's intervention in this space.
There are some press reports out of this hearing already that would tend to say that Ambassador Verveer's comments mean there really isn't a grave threat to the Internet and that there aren't these serious threats on the table. Would you agree with that characterization, or do you feel this is a very serious matter?
I am still very nervous, Mr. Chairman, about this process. I will make one observation, that it is not just a matter of the voting question and the one nation, one vote. The substance of the changes or additions to the treaty are critical, and here we have somewhat more leverage, I think. Those are not necessarily just a matter of voting. I think Ambassador Gross would probably amplify on this, but the negotiations for the actual language probably gives more leverage to us than the actual voting process does. But I have to say, Mr. Chairman, that there is a notion in what's called chaos theory called the butterfly effect. The butterfly waves its wings in Indonesia, and we have a tsunami somewhere else. I do worry that small changes can be used and interpreted in ways that could be quite deleterious to the utility of the Internet.
And Ambassador Gross, what strategies did you employ when you had the honor and opportunity to fend off international regulation of the Internet that the U.S. government should follow now?
Well, thank you very much. And if I may, before addressing that, I just want to echo exactly what Vint Cerf just said. And I think one of the keys here as we think about this is not about a discussion at the wicket about broad policies. That happens at conferences on a regular basis and are very important. And something that this chamber can particularly appreciate, the negotiations over our treaty text, language. Language is important. Language has impact. And so what will be a real test for our negotiators and for all of us is to be careful as to the language. So the language doesn't come forward and mean something today and mean something very different in the way in which, for example, Commissioner McDowell talked about, where it morphs into something very difficult and something very dangerous. This is not an issue of the ITU Secretariat. This is an issue for member states to negotiate and be very, very cognizant about. With regard to strategies, I think the strategies have been already, some of them have been adopted by the current group. That is, it's very important to be clear. One of the problems and one of the opportunities you always have in international negotiations is to find fuzzy language to cover up. One of the keys here, because of the importance of the issue and because of the implications of the issue for the over 2 billion users of the Internet worldwide, is to be very clear as to what it is the U.S. is interested in, willing to discuss and to negotiate, of which there are many things, and those areas which are red lines, things for which we will not agree. And it's not a question of finding the precise language. It is yes, it is no, it is very, very binary in that sense. And I think that will be very clear. And the building of the coalitions, as was discussed in the first panel, I think is obvious and important, and I'm very confident we'll be able to do that.
I appreciate your answers to my questions. All the panelists will now go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. So, Mr. Cerf, which countries are you most concerned about in terms of their agenda?
Well, as we heard earlier, the ones that are most visible right now, in my view, are Russia and China, who have their names on a number of proposals, but others have come forward, surprising ones. Brazil, for example, and India have surprised me with their interest in intervening and obtaining further control. The others are the ones that you would normally expect. We hear from Syria, we hear from other repressive regimes, even those in Saudi Arabia, for example. Those who are threatened by openness and freedom of expression are the ones that are most interested in gaining control through this means. Mm-hmm. There are other motivations, however, that also drive this whole process. The developing world has historically generated substantial revenue from telecommunications services, as I'm sure you are well aware. The Internet has become the alternative to much of what had been the telecommunications environment, and I see them looking for ways of adapting the earlier telecommunications settlement arrangements, interconnection arrangements, and the like, as a way of recovering revenue that they didn't have.
So just give us, Ambassador Gross mentioned this, give us one red line subject that we should never entertain.
I think two things in particular. I would never want to see any of the ITUT standards being mandatory. They should stay in voluntary form. And second, I think we should run away from any kind of settlement arrangements or enforced interconnection rules that would interfere with the open and very private sector aspect of Internet connectivity. Today, it's a voluntary system. It grows biologically, and it has benefited from that.
Is there an analogy here to the satellite system that allowed governments to just extract windfall profits in countries all around the world that ran totally contrary to what should be the policy to ensure that every citizen has real access to a phone network?
This is an economic question of an engineer, and I have this feeling you might deserve the answer that you get. To be honest, I think that we see a great desire to take advantage of Internet in ways that damage the freedom and openness and the permissionless innovation which has allowed it to grow. To allow any rules that sequester this innovation and inhibit others would damage the future of the Internet dramatically. When you see new applications coming along, they come from virtually anywhere in the world. They don't all come from the United States, and it's important that we preserve that capability.
No, thank you. No, but I appreciate the kind of the global nature that you bring to it, the butterfly effect in Indonesia here, creating a tsunami in another place. Here in the United States, we just say it's Mrs. O'Leary's cow that ultimately burns down the whole city, but that would be too American. You know, you want to give us the global view of where innovation can occur, where a disaster can emanate from in terms of the impact that it has upon the global Internet system, but that's who you are. You know, that's what this panel is really all about. Ambassador Gross, do you have give us your one red line? Do you agree with Mr. Cerf, or do you have another issue as well?
I always agree with Vint, but I think actually there are a number of red lines.
Why don't you give me one, and then I'm going to go to Ms. Wentworth.
Well, I think that the number one red line is that there should be no top-down control of the Internet, directly or indirectly, associated with any international governmental institution, including the ITU.
Okay, and Ms. Wentworth, do you have one?
We would certainly agree with the comments of Mr. Cerf with respect to making voluntary standards mandatory. That would have considerable impact on the engineering architecture that goes into the Internet. And we are also very focused on the definitions in the treaty. As we know, definitions will give you the scope, and a number of the proposals to change the definitions would in fact clearly implicate the Internet in the treaty.
Mr. Cerf, give us your 30 seconds. What do you want this committee to remember as we go forward over the next 6 months and over the next 6 years in terms of what we should be apprehensive about?
So you've already started. This hearing is a wonderful beginning. The proposed legislation speaking to this problem in a bipartisan. I'm sitting here thinking bilateral.
It's it's so rarely used that I know why it's hard to come
in a bipartisan way is also a big step. Voicing your concerns to the executive branch also extremely important, and making this visible around the world is also very important. So I think you've started that process, and I'm deeply grateful for it.
Great, thank you. My time has expired. I apologize.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. This is really, I really enjoy this discussion because it's when free nations give up their decision-making process to a world organization that is not totally defined to be free, then there should be credible concerns. And I think we're raising those today. And based upon, now I got to pull it up, it just went to sleep. we debate this issue about the UN. We get asked by our constituents all the time about the role of the UN. Should we be involved in the UN? Should we fund the UN? And I've tried to keep a balanced view where I haven't voted to leave the UN, but I've been skeptical about the role it plays. So it's keep current funding, get reforms. Here's some of the things that the UN has done. Cuba was vice president of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia also serve on that council. North Korea and Cuba serve as head of the Conference on Disarmament. Mugabe was just named a UN leader for tourism by the UN World Trade Organization. Iran sits on the UN Commission on the Status of Women and formerly chaired the joint board of the UN Development Program and the UN Population Fund. Saudi Arabia is a member of the executive board of UN Women. And so I'm not making this up, and you can't, but I mean, that is a concern. And there's also been some international debate and discourse about having a world organization based upon shared values, democracy, freedom, rule of law, things that would make this process a little bit easier than trying to negotiate with totalitarian regimes who will not have the best interest of free discourse and exchange of views and ideas and values. So I appreciate you coming. I appreciate raising this concern and making sure that we're all in and prepared to keep this great architecture. I took a picture of you all when we started, and I tweet like a lot of people, and kind of did the headline of the hearing, and I said, if it's not broken, don't fix it. The system has worked. Obviously, there's some tinkering that some of you agree that must be done, or is there not? Should we not touch it? Or if there's tinkering to be done, what should be done? Mr. Gross?
Well, thank you very much. The answer is there are always opportunities to improve anything, except for my wife, who's sitting behind me, of course. But instead, I think the key here is who does the tinkering and what the mechanism is. I think the genius of the Internet has been not only its decentralized nature, but its multi-stakeholder processes for making decisions, bringing those with the best and the brightest ideas from wherever they are, no matter what their positions are, to be able to have a say and to make those decisions in a voluntary, bottoms-up approach. That approach is the key. And I think the rub here, as you've heard this morning and early this afternoon, has been concern about a top-down governmental set of ways of dealing with what are undoubtedly real issues for real people around the world, whether it's security, whether it's fraud, it's a variety of things. We know that there are many issues that need to be addressed. Who does the addressing, what those mechanisms turns out to be, I believe, really the key to success and the way to deal with these issues.
And let me just say, I was going to ask all three, but I want to get a different question to Mr. Cerf. Any tinkering, no matter how well-intentioned, could it be flexible enough to keep the process moving forward, or will tinkering itself really mess up the stakeholder involvement in a system we have today?
So I think several observations might be relevant here. The first one is that we can't run away from the United Nations because it's too important a body for us to ignore. So we have to participate in its processes. But we have another opportunity, which I think we should emphasize, and that is to encourage more involvement, more international involvement among the various nation states in the multi-stakeholder processes that are open and available to them. That includes the Internet Governance Forum, the Internet Engineering Task Force, ICANN itself, and all of its multi-stakeholder processes. I think if we make those increasingly attractive and effective, that this could be a counterbalance and alternative to the focus of attention, which is leading in the direction of UN-based activity. This would also reinforce what we've discovered over the last 15 years, which is that multi-stakeholder processes actually work. they do bring many different points of view to the table, and they result in better policy.
Thank you. And Ms. Wentworth, I appreciate it. I don't have time to ask my follow-up question to you, but I apologize. Thank you for your testimony, and I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cerf, earlier today, Ambassador Verveer stated that the U.S. is advocating for the Wicked Conference report to be made available to the public. In addition to this proposal for increased transparency, what other specific measures can be taken to shine more light into the ITU's processes?
Well, the obvious possibility would be to open this process up to other stakeholders, which is not a typical conclusion one reaches in international agreements. But it strikes me, again, reflecting back on our successes with multi-stakeholder processes, that transparency and openness produces much better results. Now, whether anyone in the current intergovernmental world could be persuaded of that, I don't know, but I'm a great advocate of trying to include civil society, the technical world, the private sector, in matters that will have a very direct impact on them. So once again, publication of proposals and involvement of the other stakeholders would be very attractive.
Well, I would think it's critical for the U.S. and other countries that have seen the positive impact of the Internet on their economies to highlight to the ITU participants and other stakeholders the potential negative consequences of the regulation of the Internet and the world's economy. But what would be the role for the private sector in this process? How would they participate?
So the private sector actually operates most of the Internet. I don't know what the numbers are, but it probably exceeds 90%. So in some sense, no matter what we do, no matter what anyone says, it's the private sector that operates this entity. And its actions, in a sense, determine what kind of Internet we all have. So my belief is that we have an opportunity here to empower the private sector to engage in policy making, which it does not have an avenue to do today, at least not very effectively. For example, you'll hear the ITU say, well, you could be a sector member. I think Ms. Wentworth might agree with me that even as a sector member, having paid your dues, you don't always either get to participate or even have current information about what's under debate. So once again, I think openness is going to be our friend here, but we have to advocate strongly and loudly for it.
Ms. Wentworth or Mr. Gross, do you have additional comments or suggestions to increase the transparency of the ITU process?
Well, the Internet Society has certainly been an advocate of opening up this process for the wicked, but in general, the Internet policy-related discussions that are happening within the United Nations more broadly. We think that the discussions can only benefit from more transparency. We come from the technical community, and we look at some of these proposals and think that there's a lot that could be said about the technical implications of what's being proposed. How do networks actually work? And would these proposals even be consistent with the architecture that we're trying to keep in place? And the answer is no in many cases. But that voice is not heard in the current process. We speak up when we can, but we have, even as a sector member, very limited opportunities to engage.
Mr. Gross?
I think there are two sort of direct things. One is we should and continue to advocate for other members, governments, to open up their domestic processes to allow for greater participation. The U.S. has greatly benefited in terms of our negotiation, but also our decision-making by the openness that we have always traditionally had, and we want to continue to encourage that of others. But I think it also, at its core, the problem here is that the ITU is, by definition, an intergovernmental organization. Only governments have votes. And so ultimately, part of the question really is, this issue is not a big issue when you deal with certain sets of issues, but when you deal with Internet issues, for example, that at their core are about over 2 billion people and their access to information. Those are the ones that sort of call for the question not only of transparency, but also whether or not where the lines are about what the ITU should be focusing on and what it should not be focusing on. I think that's where a lot of the issues can get resolved.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes Ms. Christensen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony and for your answers. Mr. Gross, in Ambassador Revere's testimony, he stated, and all of you have voiced the same concern, that allowing governments to monitor and restrict content or impose economic costs on international data traffic are of particular concern to the United States. We've talked a lot about the monitoring and restricting of content, but could you share with us your coalition's views on the proposals regarding imposing the economic costs on international data traffic?
Sure. I think it'll come as no surprise to anyone that those are critically important issues. There are a number of different pieces of that. It's not just about the fact that it may change from a system in which there is voluntary market-driven decisions, contractual decisions made to exchange traffic, into one for which there are some proposals to have some top-down regulatory regime akin, as Vint Cerf said, to the old settlements and accounting rate systems of the old telephone system. That's certainly a substantial concern and should be a substantial concern to everyone. But also it extends to the issue of economic regulation and control about the issue of innovation generally throughout the Internet ecosystem. The ability, as Vint talked about, of innovations and changes and new technologies and new applications coming from anywhere, from anyone, and the ability for all of us to benefit from that. And ultimately, all of that often boils down to one of the, I think, the great core issues for all of us, which is the seamless flow of information. The ability of information, whether it's commercial, political, economic, social, to be able to flow seamlessly across the networks in ways that benefit the global community.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could amplify on this, just if you would permit. There's this notion of non-tariff trade barrier, and I'm sure you're very familiar with that. What I worry about is that the insidious effect of putting in detailed rules that amplify former telephone practices, in projecting those into the Internet, destroys, has the potential to destroy this sort of permissionless innovation, but it also has the possibility of destroying potential markets. This is not just an American issue. Right. We care about it because at Google we're a global operation and we want to reach everybody with our products and services, but the inverse is true. Anyone in the world should be able to reach anyone else in the world with a new product and a new service. Countries that choose to go away from that kind of openness are actually harming themselves and their own opportunities to exploit the Internet for improved GDP growth, and I worry greatly about that.
Thank you. Well, just to continue with you a minute, Mr. Cerf, many countries do struggle with the problem of bringing broadband access to their citizens and look to the International Telecommunications Union for solutions to that problem, and we talked about this briefly earlier. How should we respond to their legitimate concerns? What can the U.S. government do, and what can private parties do?
So this is a wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking it. Two observations. First of all, the ITU, through its the development organization, has actually contributed to the growth of the net. I'm a member of the Broadband Commission that seeks to find ways to expanding broadband access to the Internet all around the world. And in that sense, I tip of the hat to ITU-D for that work. At Google, we found many opportunities in the private sector to help expand access around the world. We take our equipment, which we don't need anymore, and we donate it to organizations like the National Network Startup Resources Center at the University of Oregon. They repurpose that equipment. They deliver it to people, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. Then they train them. Then they get books and documentation from Tim O'Reilly's publications, and they set them up to actually build and operate pieces of the Internet, which now get connected together to the rest of the global system. There are endless opportunities here for the private sector to engage. Anything that you and the committee can do to help make that easier to do would be most helpful. Legislation that makes it easier for us to repurpose equipment and to do training overseas would be very, very helpful. Just to advocate for that would be a good thing.
Well, thank you. I'm out of time.
Gentlelady's time's expired. We want to thank you for appearing. I would just end by saying totalitarian regimes may not care if they have systems that work. And so as you have totalitarian regimes involved in international negotiations, they may want a system that doesn't work across international lines and stuff. And a cautionary note on my part. Also, I need to say that the record will remain open for 10 days. You may get additional questions submitted to you by members of the committee. If you could reply to those if they come, we would appreciate that. Again, we appreciate your time being here, and this hearing is now adjourned.